Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's brief presentation, I'm going to be talking about evaluating modern Russian military strength through the lens of material history and providing evidence for my claim that it is a mistake for Western analysts to interpret Russian underperformance in Ukraine as a sign of general military weakness. As context for this video, I am loosely responding to a number of popular Western social media analysts who have recently been doubling down on exactly the claim I just referred to, which is this idea that the Russo-Ukrainian War has outed Russia as being less of a military threat than was previously assessed. Now, let me be clear, I actually really like and respect a lot of these analysts, and I refer to them often. I'm certainly referring to them right now with the ongoing situation in Israel. However, I obviously take issue with this specific conclusion. To be frank, I think it's a dangerous narrative which flies in the face of both common sense and historical precedent. I'm suspicious that this conclusion is driven more by emotion and abstract notions of right and wrong rather than cold objectivism. On its face, my objection is rooted in the timeless and obvious understanding that it's always safer to overestimate rather than underestimate an adversary. Lao Tzu said as much 1500 years ago. Beyond that, my objection is further rooted in a specifically historical understanding of Russia's cultural approach to warfare, which is objectively distinct from the modern Western approach. Even when we factor in Russia's very real and measurable underperformance in Ukraine, I think the historical record under similar conditions is one that should inspire extreme caution. Yes, it's important to point out all the ways in which the Russian military is weak, and I think the Western media is doing a fine job of that. However, I think it's even more important still to acknowledge the ways in which they project strength, especially when that strength is underreported or poorly translated to Western observers. As I'll elaborate on shortly, everything I have seen in Ukraine indicates that the Russians still possess their single most historically proven warfighting characteristic, something that I'm not convinced the West adequately appreciates or has a compelling answer to. Based on that alone, I think it's far too early to be writing them off as a dangerous adversary. As one additional disclaimer before I begin, I want to say in no uncertain terms that I'm not here to comment on the morality of the war in Ukraine, nor am I providing this analysis with the intent of supporting or condemning either side. I understand that there are a range of passionate opinions on this war, and I'm not here to challenge any of those or otherwise sort them out. That said, I am deeply opposed in principle to military analyses which rely on lionizing or dehumanizing the participants. Such psychological tricks certainly have utility in the trenches and on the battlefield, but I don't believe they have any place in a bird's-eye view analysis. Trigger pullers need to believe whatever they need to believe in order to do their jobs effectively. But the reality is that human warfare is almost never an existential battle between good and evil, but is instead a messy and complex affair in which the best and worst expressions of humanity are present on all sides. I'm an American, and I do not consider myself adequately positioned to judge a war that is happening on the other side of the planet. Obviously, I hope the war resolves in such a way that best reflects the will of the civilians who own and live on the disputed territory, but rarely do things work out so simply. My only goal in this video is to do what I've always tried to do on this channel, which is to engage in the material history and cultural storytelling of small arms, such that I may offer faithful testimony for the past in hopes of a more peaceful future. With all that in mind, let's dive in. For anyone who isn't aware, this is a Mosin rifle. It's a first-generation manually operated smokeless battle rifle developed by the Russian Empire in 1891. It saw its first major combat use in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, and believe it or not, it remains in limited service to this day, particularly among fighters from the Donetsk People's Republic. This rifle was developed alongside the 7.62 by 54 millimeter rimmed cartridge, which is itself the oldest military cartridge to remain in widespread use. Just to give a sense of scale, one of the men who directly contributed to the original design of this cartridge was esteemed Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, better known as the father of the modern periodic table of the elements. In summary, this is 130-year-old Russian technology, relatively unchanged after all those decades, which has refused to accept retirement. There are 3 reasons I'm showing you this rifle. First, I'm establishing this rifle as a physical link to the past. As previously stated, my argument today is largely informed by material history, and this rifle is tangible evidence that modern events exist in relationship to an established timeline. When we see footage of young men dying in trenches with this rifle by their side, we know that we are seeing something that has happened before. We therefore also know that it is in our immediate interest to understand why it happened before, and more importantly, where it led. Second, I am establishing this rifle as a symbolic representation for the Russian military mindset, specifically to create contrast with the Western military mindset. This is where material history starts to blend with cultural storytelling. Let me give you an example. For those who aren't already familiar with the Mosin, you might reasonably expect it to be a particularly good weapon. For most Westerners, that would be the most logical reason for it to have persisted all this time when so many other competitor weapons have not. In our cultural conception of reality, that is to say a Western conception of reality, we typically expect that which is good to outlast that which is bad. Sometimes that holds true, but not always, and certainly not in this case. The thing is, this rifle is laughably outdated now, and it wasn't even that good 130 years ago. It's rugged, lethal, and basically effective, which counts for something, but beyond that, it's actually quite crude and inefficient. Its historic and enduring relevance cannot be adequately explained through any expression of the qualities we tend to value in the West, and that's because it's not a product of a Western approach to warfare. It's a product of the Russian approach to warfare, which finds value in a totally distinct and far more cynical collection of traits. The reality is that this rifle was never intended to be a good weapon for good soldiers. It was intended to be a disposable weapon for disposable soldiers. And that in and of itself tells us a great deal about the Russian approach to warfare. However unpalatable that mindset may be towards the shared sensibilities of the cultural West, we can't dismiss it as unthreatening or ineffective. And again, all this is a symbol for something bigger. Nobody actually thinks that the presence of weapons like the Mosin are going to change the outcome of a modern war, but there are many who seem to think the presence of inferior or even disposable technology in general will ultimately make the difference. Many Western assessments of Russian military weakness place heavy emphasis on their reliance on outdated tanks, fighting vehicles, aircraft, and artillery. And it goes beyond that. We place greater emphasis still on things like low morale, high casualties, international pressure, corruption, inefficient command structures, domestic unpopularity, and organizational infighting, all things which we consider to be incompatible with long-term military success. The Mosin rifle is a reminder to us that Russia has never valued precisely the same things that we value, and they have never fought precisely the same way that we fight. And yet, like this rifle, they are still here. We can't take that discrepancy lightly, nor can we entertain the fantasy that our modern value system has a monopoly on battlefield success. That isn't a historically supported conclusion. Countless empires have been built on the backs of poorly equipped conscripts and human cannon fodder, and however barbaric such tactics might seem, it would behoove us to keep in mind that war is an inherently barbaric endeavor. We mock the Russians for being primitive, and yet we underestimate their capabilities in the most primitive expression of human life. That's a dangerous game to play. Third and finally, this particular model of Mosin rifle is intrinsically tied to a particularly relevant historical conflict, and that is the Russo-Finnish Wars, often called the Winter War and Continuation War. Briefly, for my fellow gun nerds, this is a 1943 Tikka M9130, which is a wartime production Finnish-made clone of the Soviet M9130. There's a high probability that at least some of the parts in this rifle were carried into Finland by Soviet soldiers before being captured, rebuilt, improved, and thrust back into the fight from the other side. The reason I'm showcasing this example is because it is my strong opinion that there are undeniable parallels between the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine and the 1939 Russian invasion of Finland. It is my belief that anyone who appreciates these parallels would balk at the idea of underestimating Russian military power, especially if this perceived weakness is based on Western analyses of a botched invasion and a generally poorly performing military armed with outdated equipment. Something very similar has happened before, and it didn't go the way you might expect. So now let's talk about what actually happened in Finland in 1939, what came after that, and why all of this may still be relevant today. As the 1930s drew to a close, Stalin's Soviet Union was hungrily eyeing neighboring territories in Finland. Although this particular geopolitical spectacle took place more than 80 years ago, it would have been all too familiar for those of us who closely watched the events leading up to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Stalin slowly but surely built up justification for this land grab, citing of all things Russian security concerns. The Red Army built up en masse along the Finnish border and conducted prolonged military exercises in what many interpreted to be merely a provocative show of force designed to create negotiation leverage. We know now that the Russians were not seeking leverage so much as they were doing exactly what they appeared to be doing, which was staging and preparing a full-scale invasion force. The Russians' primary political objective at this time seems to have been to instigate a border incident which they could use as a pretext for the invasion they were already planning to launch. Lo and behold, there was just such a critical artillery strike launched against Russian border troops, although most historians today seem to agree that this was a false flag operation conducted by the Russian NKVD themselves. 4 days later, however, on November 30th, 1939, 450,000 Soviet troops poured over the border and the Winter War began. In yet another chilling parallel to the modern Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia was rapidly accused of indiscriminately bombing civilian targets, despite an apparent lack of strategic benefit to these attacks. As a brief interjection of pretty cool and relevant trivia, it was precisely this bombing campaign that led to the invention of the term Molotov cocktail. The Russian foreign minister at the time of the Winter War, so the man who held the position which is currently occupied by Sergei Lavrov, was named Vyacheslav Molotov. Like the later Lavrov, one of Molotov's chief responsibilities was to find creative ways to justify Russian military actions on the world stage, and he once famously claimed that the high explosive munitions Russia was dropping on Finnish residential areas were actually humanitarian food rations. This led to the Finns sarcastically nicknaming these Russian bombs Molotov breadbaskets, and when these same Finnish defenders started to use improvised liquid-based incendiary devices to knock out Russian tanks, they sarcastically called these Molotov cocktails, as in a refreshing beverage to go with the foreign minister's alleged food deliveries. Obviously, the Finnish people have a remarkable sense of humor, but that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is that when history geeks like myself watched Ukrainian civilians packing Molotov cocktails to throw at Russian tanks, we had an uncomfortable sense of déjà vu. In any case, the lead-up, initial attack, and prolonged war associated with the historic Russian invasion of Finland shares a remarkably similar trajectory to the modern Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite being a much stronger force on paper, Russian tactical performance in Finland quickly proved to be underwhelming. Their equipment didn't live up to expectations, they failed to quickly achieve strategic objectives, and ultimately their advance was halted by unexpectedly ferocious resistance from the highly motivated Finnish defenders. Defenders, by the way, who were bolstered by a smattering of foreign fighters and material aid. Before too long, the tides had turned, and the Russians found themselves in a defensive posture, enduring heavy losses just to hold the border territories they had already claimed. Ring a bell? Again, this is not the first time we have seen this. Here's where the story gets really interesting, though. Throughout the Winter War, there was a third party watching intently, a Western power with truly unrivaled military might. That third party, of course, was Nazi Germany. Hitler was in the midst of his own, far more ambitious campaign of territorial expansion, and the Russian homeland had always been in his sights. As Russia floundered in Finland, German military analysts began to foam at the mouth from excitement, smelling blood in the water. Again, the narrative was disturbingly familiar. They've lost too many men and too much equipment, the Germans said. They are not the military power we thought they were. We took Paris, Brussels, Antwerp, Warsaw, and Oslo nearly simultaneously, and we have London against the ropes. The Russians couldn't even take Helsinki. A single SS Panzer battalion could take Moscow in a month. I'm really hoping this is starting to ring a bell by now, because I see statements like this every day in Western and American media. Either way, I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone that however rational and perhaps even obvious these German assessments may have seemed at the time, they were wrong, and they directly led to the single costliest miscalculation in the history of human conflict. I'll recount what actually happened as briefly as possible. After first merely fighting the Russians by proxy, the Germans decided to conduct a full-scale invasion of Russia. Unlike Russia, the Germans were experts in the tactics of invasion, and the war began exactly as they planned. The Germans executed a textbook blitzkrieg assault, which is a technique of combined arms warfare, which is so effective that it still serves as a basic template for the US military today. Within the first days and weeks of the invasion, Germany decapitated Soviet command and control and dealt devastating blows to the Russian military infrastructure. For their part, the Russians honored their long-standing military tradition of responding as poorly as was conceivably possible, and consequently they endured losses on a scale which no other military force in human history has come close to. Just to provide a sense of scale, there were probably more Russians killed in action during the first 3 months of this war than there have been American service members killed in action over our entire 250-year history. Please pause for a moment and soak that in. Now, factor in that those were Russia's best soldiers being destroyed and captured alongside their best equipment. Still ringing bells? Good. In the opening salvo of the war, the Russian military had already sustained more damage than any of the Western European countries which Hitler had already steamrolled. But this is where the story starts to get weird. Having lost entire armies of professional soldiers, the Russians made new armies of untrained peasants. Having lost hundreds of thousands of modern weapons, they made millions of new, cruder weapons like this one. And then they lost those new armies and those new weapons. So they did it again. They gave women sniper rifles and put them in the cockpits of bombers. They conscripted 16 and 17-year-old boys and sent them to the front line to face Hitler's best units. And then those women and boys died too, so they sent more. Total casualties are speculative at best, but we know that somewhere in the ballpark of 30 million Russians died on the Eastern Front, roughly a third of whom were combatants, a third of whom were civilians who got caught in the crossfire, and a third of whom were civilians who died of indirect causes still related to the war. No country in human history has lost more people in war than Russia did during World War II. But here's the really weird part. Despite their basically incalculable losses, Russia still managed to kill more Nazis than the rest of the Allies combined. And yes, Russia was our ally during this war, a fact that Trudeau's Canadian government recently made a mockery of itself by forgetting. Obviously, the Russians aren't our ally anymore, but the takeaway here is that Russia still exists and Nazi Germany does not. Despite enduring much heavier losses, the Russians never stopped replacing those losses, and eventually the Germans did. As a consequence, a hammer and sickle flag flew over Berlin for the next 40 years. And if you're wondering in the back of your mind, well, whatever happened to that territory Russia took from Finland in the lead up to this whole bloodbath? Well, guess what? That territory is still part of the Russian Federation to this day. Now, let me be clear once again, I'm not glorifying Russia here, and if you think I am, you're not listening to what I'm saying. The Eastern Front of World War II was one of the worst things that has ever happened in human history, and no one suffered more for Russian victory than did the Russian people. They say that no one truly wins a war, and if ever there was a good example of it, it would probably be the Eastern Front. That said, the Soviet Union did ultimately walk away from this war as an emergent superpower, and Nazi Germany lay buried in a shallow grave, and there's a lesson in that. That lesson is this: a botched invasion, poor equipment, poor morale, poor leadership, and heavy casualties do not preclude Russia's ability to deliver a lethal blow to a technically superior adversary. Russia's most historically dangerous military capability exists completely outside of that conventional template for military strength. And that is, of course, Russia's unique ability to leverage disposable human life. Russia does not outfight its enemies, and it certainly doesn't outsmart them. Russia does not win wars with artillery, air power, mechanized war machines, or tactics. They overwhelm their adversaries with endless waves of replaceable human bodies, knowing that if nothing else, they can at least drown their adversaries with Russian blood. However tempting it may be for Western analysts to dismiss that strategy as ineffective, the last time Western analysts made that mistake, many of them ended up buried in unmarked graves outside of Siberian work camps. One more statistic for you. A lot of people seem to think that the Russian loss rate in Ukraine is unsustainable. If Russia was a Western country, that would probably be true. Let's try to look at those numbers from a Russian perspective, however. The Russian loss rate during the first year of fighting with Ukraine was approximately 930 times less than it was during their first year of fighting with Germany. In other words, the Russians could fight at this current tempo for another 930 years before they would have endured the level of human loss that they endured during the first year of a war against the Nazis, which again was a war that they technically won. So what's the takeaway here? Listen, I can't see the future, and I don't pretend that I can. Countries can change, emergent technologies are important, and we aren't always doomed to repeat the past. I've oversimplified elements of this analysis, and there are countless relevant factors which I haven't or couldn't include in this discussion. I'm certainly not saying we need to tiptoe around Russian aggression or cower at Russian threats. All I'm saying, for the love of all that is good, is don't forget who we are dealing with, and don't underestimate their ability to leverage the one thing that has made them truly dangerous in the past. When I look at what's unfolding in Ukraine from a historically informed perspective, I see no cause for celebration. I see the scariest thing I could have expected to see, which is Russia fighting exactly the way Russia has always fought. They've always been bad at invasions. They've always been corrupt, inefficient, and poorly equipped. They've always exaggerated and blatantly lied about their capabilities, made moronic tactical decisions, and been slow to adapt. And thank goodness for all of that. What really scares me, however, is when I see them pulling fighters from prisons, sending conscripts over the border without telling them they're about to take fire, sending penal battalions armed only with shovels into the gray zone to dig new trenches, and telling them that at least the Ukrainians will give them a chance, but if they refuse those orders, they will be summarily executed by their own officers. That's a Russia we have seen before, and that's a Russia I know we would be fools to underestimate. And that's the video, guys. A little different than usual, I know, but hopefully something you all found to be well within the scope of this channel. As a historic firearm enthusiast, I think some days are best for shooting cans off fence posts, and some days are best for taking unflinching glimpses into the history of human conflict, and today was one of the latter days. As I frequently joke on this channel, I believe that we as human beings are destined to either be talking about history or living history. I don't think there's much in between, and while I'm personally prepared for either, I greatly prefer the former. And that's it, guys. So as always, if you found this video to be worth the time you spent watching it, I would greatly appreciate if you could take the time to let me know by hitting any combination of like, comment, or subscribe. Those are the things that motivate me to make future videos. Additionally, feel free to click on my channel to find a wide range of other historical and firearm related content. Thanks again, stay safe, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.